where there'll be no pollution in that land. Be no pollution in that land.
Air pollution reached what officials called unsatisfactorily high levels.
Be no pollution in that.
The air pollution was so bad I had to pull off the highway because I couldn't see.
Be no pollution.
It doesn't make sense to say we cannot afford to protect our environment.
No pollution in that.
The year was 1970. Americans were tired of choking on a sea of pollution, and they demanded change.
Working people saying, we don't need this air pollution. It's affecting our health and it's affecting our welfare, and we need to clean it up.
The response was the Clean Air Act, groundbreaking legislation signed by President Richard Nixon. Leon Billings, a young aide to Maine Senator Ed Muskie, helped write it.
We had an air pollution episode in Washington, D.C. while we were writing the Clean Air Act. We were sitting in a conference room and looking out the window, and the smog was pervasive. And a senator from Virginia named William Spong said, we can't not respond to this problem.
The bill was just 38 pages long, but had far-reaching effects, from limiting air pollution and getting lead out of gasoline to changing how citizens could demand action.
Before the 1970 Clean Air Act, there was no concept of citizen suits allowing citizens to go into federal courts to enforce mandatory requirements on a federal agency. Simply didn't exist, unprecedented. We wrote into the law that the auto industry had to achieve a 90% reduction in auto emissions, unheard of in federal law.
Major corporations argued it couldn't be done. It would be too expensive and would hurt the economy. Mobil Oil ran an ad calling the act a $66 billion mistake.
Four major CEOs of these companies, General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, and American Motors, they went to the White House to talk to the president about it. They went to the Congress and talked to them that the Clean Air Act should not pass.
Bill Ruckelshaus was the EPA's first administrator.
The Clean Air Act passed the House 374 to 1. It passed the Senate 74 to nothing. So their impact on the political system was essentially zero.
Despite their alarms, it took automakers just 4 years to make their cars clean enough to meet the new standards.
We wrote those emission reductions into the law, the 90% reduction, based on what we knew had to be done. But we had no idea of whether it could be done.
The law even found an unlikely ally in President Richard Nixon.
Shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
Despite Nixon's support for the act, some say it was more about the upcoming '72 election than his concern for clean air.
I don't think Nixon had a bone in his body that cared about the environment.
We've never had a president before or since, with the possible exception of Teddy Roosevelt, who had anywhere near the environmental record that Nixon did. And he was a reluctant warrior, I'll tell you. But nevertheless, he was a warrior.
And so was Ruckelshaus. He used the act aggressively, suing a number of cities to demand improvement in air quality. And it worked. According to the EPA, in its first 20 years alone, the act prevented more than 200,000 premature deaths, nearly 700,000 cases of chronic bronchitis, and 18 million cases of respiratory disease among children. But some say the economy has paid a price.
I think we could still have clean air without all of the unnecessary underbrush that's grown up over the years.
Jeff Olmsted ran the EPA's air division under President George W. Bush and is now a lobbyist for a number of power companies. He says parts of the Clean Air Act have worked, but it often smothers businesses with red tape.
There is no doubt that the permitting hurdles that you have to go through to build a big industrial plant are much more difficult to overcome in this country than in other countries. And as a result, you do see much more heavy manufacturing moving to other countries. And I don't think that's been a good thing for this country.
The environmental laws have not been a threat to our economic development. They've shown that it's not a choice between economic growth and environmental protection. The two go hand in hand.
California Congressman Henry Waxman wrote the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, clamping down on pollutants that caused acid rain and ozone depletion.
We've cut air pollution by 60% at a time when our economy was growing 200%. So it certainly didn't impede the growth of the economy.
Now the challenge of balancing environmental protection and economic growth is entering a new frontier. EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson wants to use the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon emissions.
Not only is she going to, she has to. The Supreme Court has held that carbon dioxide is a pollutant within the context of the Clean Air Act. So she has to look at what tools there are in the Clean Air Act which will allow her to regulate carbon.
CO2 is just completely different, and so if we were to reduce our CO2 emissions by 20%, that doesn't really make a difference in terms of the overall global problem, because a ton of CO2 that's emitted in New York has exactly the same effect in New York as a ton of CO2 emitted in Shanghai or Bangkok, and so it's just a very different type of problem, and it's the type of problem that the Clean Air Act just was not designed to deal with.
So at age 40, the Clean Air Act faces a midlife crisis. Can it confront environmental problems unheard of at its birth?
There is no doubt that the Clean Air Act has been one of the signal achievements of U.S. environmental policy, probably the most important achievement of U.S. environmental policy. I think the question now is, as we're nearing the 40th anniversary, whether people will essentially destroy the Clean Air Act by trying to use it for things it was never meant to do.
40 years after those protests, what role the Clean Air Act will play in the future remains a question. But the Act supporters say its impact is absolutely clear.
Probably breathing a lot cleaner air, which means that if you're not smoking, you're going to probably live a lot longer. And that's something. Not too many laws can say that.
In Washington, Dan Goldstein, Energy Now.